Share screen.
Yeah, so you could just spin.
Share. I hope you all are seeing what I'm seeing. Are you all seeing a slide?
Yes.
Okay, good. All right. We left Junipero Serra just on the verge of going to Baja, but this program on Fareed Zakaria's program Sunday morning. He presented it over the holidays, and it's just been sticking with me. And I just wanted to process it a little bit more. So I hope you don't mind putting Junipero Serra in abeyance for another week. So we had gone through the history of the Jewish people, starting with Abraham, and this is really our fourth session. The first session went up to the destruction of the Second Temple and the Diaspora. Then we made some arbitrary cuts at World War One, and then based on an article that Ramsey had recommended, we stopped at 1967. So fortuitously, Fareed Zakaria, his interview with two historians, one Israeli and one Palestinian, just filled in that gap, I think, rather nicely. And we are stopping at 2002 just because it takes 20 years for history to really gel. Okay, so off we go. This was the name of the program, the Road to War, CNN GPS special. Supplementing that, there's a very good frontline series, Shattered Dreams of Peace, that covers kind of the same territory. So just our previous session, as I said, one, Abraham to Diaspora, two, the Diaspora to World War I to 1967, and then today. And I have put together links to all those sessions if anybody wants to go back and extract the various segments. Obviously, we do other things in an hour, but if you want to reconstruct that, it's possible. But where we're basically headed for from 1967 is this big day in 1993, a historic day where Bill Clinton gets all the significant parties into the Rose Garden, Yasser Arafat and Yitzhak Rabin, Shimon Peres, and I think this is a Palestinian assistant. And we'll just go on from there. So there was this famous moment where they're supposed to shake hands. And Yasser Arafat is more eager to be recognized because he has no official recognition. And this is a huge step for him. Yitzhak Rabin, a general, but of the left, is very reluctant to shake his hand. He does not grab the hand instantly. There's a long, pregnant pause. Clinton is no doubt biting his lip. And then they finally, much to everybody's relief, shake hands. And then Yasser Arafat is overcome with emotion of the moment. And that's interesting because it had been a long road to 1993. The first proposal was actually made in 1937. There was the British, when they were in control of Palestine, had put together a commission called the Peel Commission. And that was rejected by Palestinian leadership. Then in 1947, it got international imprimatur at the United Nations, or the General Assembly put its stamp of approval on a two-state solution, and the Palestinians rejected that. So this is just a very schematic map. The actual map is much more complicated because the West Bank is not autonomous Palestinian territory. It was before 1967, but now what that former solid thing has been divvied up into little cantons by the Israelis for security purposes. But every security step they've taken has failed, and this is another moment of truth, much like the Yom Kippur war, which challenged Israel's possession of the Sinai. So we'll see. And so off they went. And the guy that really deserves a lot of credit for the Oslo Accords was James Baker. He had come in. He served under both Reagan and Bush, but he had a lot more power under Papa Bush. He was more even-handed than anybody had been. And in this book, he is called actually brutal with the Israelis, and particularly Netanyahu, who before he became prime minister was in the foreign ministry. So he deserves a lot of the credit. And let's just kind of look at what he did. Behind the scenes at Oslo, he before that happened, he was lobbying both the Palestinians and the Israelis. He was the first American to officially negotiate with the Palestinians. And he was the first one that was able to put together a comprehensive a peace conference, which is going to lead to Oslo. And the idea was to not nickel and dime, but to address all the outstanding issues. And there was a preliminary meeting before Oslo. It took place in Madrid in 1991. And he was the one that banged heads and got people to turn up for that led to Oslo. And I don't know if anybody else saw a docudrama where they recreated what actually happened in Oslo. Did anybody else see that? I can't find it. I'll just have to look some more. But it was very dramatic what was going on in the winter in Oslo, and how the Palestinians and the Israelis, used to warmer weather, were brought together. Um, so the one thing that really bugged both Baker and Bush were the settlements, and that's where we ended in 1967. That essay in the New York Times said the settlements were such a game changer that you just have to shift gears to talk before 1967 and after the settlements. And what did Baker do? The Americans had been annoyed that the Jews had not stayed out of settling their conquered territory. There were UN resolutions that we'll get to that forbade that. But the Israelis, having control of security, were able to pretty much do what they wanted. And it doesn't seem like such a big deal now when you consider all the foreign aid that we give to Israel, and they're the number one receptor of our foreign aid. But Jim Baker fired the first shot by saying the United States was no longer going to guarantee housing loans. And Israel was dealing with a new wave of immigration from the Soviet Union, which was falling apart in the 1980s, and they had loosened their strictures on travel, and Jews were leaving in the tens of thousands and coming to Israel. And as we'll see, that those immigrants were very conservative, and they joined the Israeli right and changed the complexion of Israeli politics. But they knew that these housing loans for Jewish immigrants were going to wind up in the West Bank. And they made the link, and they said, we know what you're up to, and we're not going to guarantee these housing loans. And it was a big deal because they were dealing with Yitzhak Shamir, and he lost his election based on that. He was from the right-wing Likud party. And he was pushed out, and that's how Yitzhak Rabin of the Labor Party got into power to turn up on the White House lawn to negotiate a recognition of the PLO and to start negotiating land for peace with the Palestinians. All right, so what happened in America as a result? Well, we know about lobbies and how strong they are in our country, and the Israeli lobby is the major organization is AIPAC, the American Israeli Public Affairs Committee. And they were shocked, and they often will put out the anti-Semitism card. Some would say irresponsibly occasionally, not always, but sometimes. And this is what has always bugged U.S. presidents, but Baker and Bush, two hard-nosed Texans, could take it. And then Baker showed up at an AIPAC conference and told them, listen, it's unrealistic, your vision of greater Israel, stop the settlements. And you got to reach out to the Palestinians. They deserve political rights. Jimmy Carter used the apartheid analogy. as did John Kerry later on when he was serving as Obama's Secretary of State. But how did the Senate respond to Baker's censoring and withholding guarantees for housing loans? They are more sensitive to lobbying pressure because a lobbyist can come into their state and affect an election. They could have immediate results on senators, and the senators did not go along with it, at least publicly. So this is the Palestinian scholar who appears on Fareed. Fareed is the moderator. He goes back and forth between these historians, and I thought he did it very deftly. I know some of you have listened to it and agree. And he's quite eloquent and reasonable, as is the Israeli, Benny Morris, who is of the left, one of the early leftist Zionists. And they had a very decent information-filled conversation. And it was the chronology that just blew me away. Zakaria just took it year by year, asking follow-up questions. It really started off with one of the big changes, and this may be the result of Jim Baker and Papa Bush pressure, but the PLO in 1998 abandoned its goal of eliminating Israel and gave it a tentative recognition, saying it was unrealistic. So bowing to reality. This was the PLO convention in 1988, and there's Arafat with all his leaders. And remember, a lot of these guys were militants. They had been involved in terrorism. Arafat himself, which is why Rabin was so reluctant to shake his hand, had put his stamp of approval on Munich, the Olympics there, and what happened. And I think I mentioned last week, Iko and I just watched the movie again, Munich. Academy Award winning Steven Spielberg. And so it's a whole new ball game. And as a result of the Oslo Accords, the first step is to give the PLO a governing authority. And they move into the West Bank and Gaza in 1993 to start administering the territory. And they take over from Israelis at checkpoints, removing an irritation. And we're going to see that Israeli soldiers had often been the target of Palestinian resistance. So what was that resistance? Hamas, their actual first so-called combat operation against Israeli soldiers, and it's important to distinguish between soldiers and civilians, as Fareed Zakaria made clear, was in 1989 when they abducted and killed 2 Israeli soldiers. So they were involved in the first Intifada. They were objecting to all the checkpoints and intimidation and harassment in the West Bank. And also, there were the Temple Mount killings. So all this kind of recedes in memory. But as you're listening to the chronology, and these two historians bring everything together, it was often surprising. So we forget that, and why should we remember something that happened over 30 years ago? But that Israeli radicals wanted to place a keystone for the third temple. Remember, the second temple had been destroyed by the Romans. So they were up on Temple Mount, where there is currently a mosque, Al-Aqsa, a holy place, and very, very sensitive place for Israelis to go. They've usually confined themselves to the West Wall, where they pray, without going up on to the top of the former foundation. And the reaction to the extremists up on Temple Mount led to violence that killed 17 Palestinians. And so they're the ones that die in things like Temple Mount. And it was then that Hamas intensified its campaign of abductions, mostly of soldiers. They declared every Israeli soldier as a target. So what's the history of Hamas? And this is a picture from Temple Mount and chaos from the demonstrators and counter demonstrators. Hamas had this guy called the Engineer, and he had launched the first suicide attack by Hamas in 1993. In April, earlier in the year. He was targeting, as we said before, Israeli soldiers, but this was the first time that it was a suicide attack against Israeli soldiers. Only 2 people died, and they were both Palestinians, the bomber and some Palestinian from a nearby village. There was a bus of Israeli soldiers, and 8 of them were slightly injured. And he was the only bomber all the way until 1996. And I'll tell you what happened in 1996 in more detail later, but he's assassinated himself. Okay, so here's the thing that just made me sit bolt upright. The sequence of this, after the Oslo celebration at the White House, pretty close after that is the massacre at the Cave of the Patriarchs. The Cave of the Patriarchs is the tomb of Abraham and Sarah, purportedly. And this is in Hebron. And this is terrible. This is terrible. You had, I think, 800 people praying, and an American Israeli physician, of all things, had settled illegally in the West Bank. His name was Baruch Goldstein, And this is the larger building of the tomb of Abraham and Sarah. And he'd gone in there with a gun issued by the Israeli military. He had served in the military, but more as a physician. But he had a gun issued by the Israeli military, as many settlers did. And he went in, and it was during Ramadan, which overlapped that year with Purim, and he was dressed in military uniform, which I guess he had from his day serving as an army physician, and he opened fire on 800 worshipers. Needless to say, the crowd immediately turned on him, and he was murdered on the spot. And what was Israel's response? They identified certain Israeli settlers who were they considered extremists, and they forbade them from entering certain Palestinian towns. These settlers, and just these settlers, were to turn in their army-issued rifles. The PLO rejected that as being not nearly enough, demanded that all settlers be disarmed, the ones that were carrying Israeli-issued arms, and that an international force be created to protect Palestinians in this area where there was to be no settlement. This was UN a proclamation. So the disturbing thing is that Goldstein's gravesite became a pilgrimage site for Jewish extremists, along with a complimentary set of words. And finally, in 1999, Israel passed a law outlawing monuments to terrorists, and counted this tombstone as part of that. And it said that he was a martyr with clean hands and a pure heart. Well, after that law was passed, a military chaplain supervised as the ground was covered with gravel. That was Israel's way out of that, which probably was considered insufficient by Palestinians. And so, of course, protests followed that atrocity. And now you get response, counter response, the vicious circle of violence, and the magic spell of Oslo is broken. So there were 30. Goldstein killed 30 outright, but another 29 were killed by the Israeli Defense Force in the ensuing violent protests. Nevertheless, Oslo was alive enough for the Nobel Peace Prize to be rewarded to Rabin, Peres, and Arafat. And Arafat was very gracious, congratulating his partners in peace. It was only after Hebron massacre that Hamas began suicide attacks targeting civilians. That was the sequence. And that really brought me up when I heard it the first time. My gosh, of course. So what was Hamas? The history of Hamas is interesting. It was started by a quadriplegic Yassin in 1987. Why was he a quadriplegic? It was when he was 12 years old, an innocent bout of wrestling with a friend who snapped his neck. And obviously there was no medical care for him in Gaza in 1997. His family had been forcibly removed from their home in Ashkelon, which is in southern Israel, not far from Gaza. And so their family had suffered directly in 1947. He relied on his group of followers for everything, obviously, for feeding, transportation, communication. And he was finally taken into military custody in 1990. There was evidence that he ordered the killings of Palestinian collaborators, not Israelis at that time. But then he ordered the abduction of Israeli soldiers in the Temple Mount protests. All this was in the context of the first Antifada. Yassin was eventually released in 1997 and as part of a prisoner swap that Jordan had arranged. But he got involved, and Hamas gets most of their money and backing from Iran, not from Sunni countries, but from a Shiite country. They get their backing, as does Hezbollah. And finally, in 2004, there was a female suicide bomber who killed Hamas, suicide bomber that killed 4 civilians. And Yassin made a public statement and a prayer that it was her obligation to make jihad in the current situation. And so it was shortly after that an Israeli helicopter took him out with a missile right as he was coming out of prayer in Gaza, in a very public missile strike in 2004. And that's why we're not really talking about much that's happened in the last 20 years. It's still too raw. Okay, so back to Oslo, 1995. That it had survived all the turmoil and Temple Mount and demonstrations. That had even survived the massacre at Hebron, the Nobel Prize and all that. But some Israelis still mistrusted the Palestinians. They wanted all of ancient Judea and Samaria. Even the enclaves for Palestinians were too much. Those little green dots on the map, and a series of maps labeled "Disappearing Palestine." So they did not want land for peace. That was the Oslo formula: peace, and you get your land back. But Rabin was still in, and here he's singing a song of peace that says, "Do not whisper a prayer." But then he added, be careful, there are enemies to the peace movement. And shortly after he said that, he was assassinated at a rally in Tel Aviv. Who killed him? another Jewish extremist. And here's the headline, and here's the assassin. He was a law student, so we've had a medical doctor and a law student carrying out these violent acts. He was a religious fanatic, and he was active in going into the West Bank and supporting settler activity, including building new illegal outposts. He was especially active in Hebron, even after the massacre there. Imagine living in Hebron if you're Palestinian and you see Jews leading marches through your streets. He never has expressed regret. He is Yemenite, which is Sephardic Jews that come from Asia, as opposed to Ashkenazi, those that have come back from diaspora to Europe. And he had been so active and eloquent in the youth movement that his next assignment was going to be to teach Judaism in Latvia. Go figure. An interesting sidelight, just reading about his personal life. He had a platonic relationship with another law student from an Ashkenazi family, and she had broken up with him because her parents didn't want their daughter to marry a Sephardic Jew. But she invited him to the wedding from when she married one of Amir's best friends. And Amir attended the wedding, good sport that he was, but he felt into a deep depression. This is him going back to the scene of the crime with the investigators. So unlike Goldstein, who'd been dealt with immediately, he went through the judicial process and is still alive in prison, where he got married and fathered a child. Go figure. So Khalidi was given a chance to speak, and I thought some of his comments in a couple of minutes were worthy of repeating. He had been very optimistic, which made all these events particularly tragic. He saw the glimmerings of some kind of understanding between Yitzhak Rabin and Arafat. And he had thought that even after the Hebron massacre, it had still been possible to resuscitate the good feeling had the Perez enforced a policy of taking away weapons from the settlers, and maybe even removing some of the hardcore settlers, rather than taking away their guns. He thought, nobody knows for sure, you can't redo history, but if that had been done in response, okay, you committed this atrocity, we can't trust you to live in the occupied territories anymore. A very different message would have gone to the Palestinians. As it was, the Palestinian says, look what can happen without serious consequences. We didn't get an international force to supervise and help us guarantee our safety. All we have still is the Israeli army, who had a doctor that took one of the Israeli army's guns and massacred 30 of our people at prayer. So the hardcore began to take hold. And so this new history that was blossoming, they were no longer on the right path. The Palestinian people had been so happy and celebrated after the Oslo Accords were signed and hands had been shaken. They were glad that the Palestinian Authority was coming in to govern the West Bank and Gaza. And they saw it as the first step towards independence. So Zakaria asked, was anything really retrievable at that point? What could have been done to stop the vicious circle? Well, Perez had become the new leader, and there was all this demonstrating against Israelis by Palestinians. Hamas was very active, organizing a protest. And then Perez made a decision to take out the engineer that I talked about earlier, the one that was designing the suicide bombs. And that started another wave of bombings by Hamas. And when the election came, in that environment with Hamas promulgating the violence, Netanyahu defeated Perez in that election, which lost 3 years of momentum. And basically, it was an anti-Hamas election. So Hamas, they get more radical. And here's Yassim with a guy holding a gun, saying, "This is Palestinians. This is our only chance." Hamas was very active in providing food and education for the poor, so social services. They were good at that. Their power eventually grew and grew. So how did Israel take out the engineer? They somehow got a hold of his cell phone and set it up so when it rang at a certain time, it would explode. And that's what happened to the engineer. Then the engineer's death is decried, and there follows again this vicious cycle all the way down. Netanyahu's in power. He definitely rejects the whole idea of a two-state solution. We know now that he has been actually aiding Hamas to undermine the PLO. He's been playing the two off of each other. So if the PLO is getting stronger, he gives aid secretly to Hamas and vice versa. And he's encouraged new settlements. And there was finally a sense 3 years later that, wait a minute, Netanyahu's going too far the other way. So he got voted out. The pendulum swings. Barak gets elected. Another decorated former Israeli general is elected by labor in a landslide. And his goal is, let's try one last time to resuscitate Oslo, and let's do it quick this time, all or nothing. And so everything's put on the table. The future of Israel, the solution of the refugee problem, the final borders, Palestinian statehood, water, scarce resource. How do you divide that? And for that, he was invited to Camp David by Clinton, who wanted to have another go at Arafat. And the negotiations failed. Arafat turned his back on the best deal that had ever been offered because he wanted to negotiate a little bit longer to get the Palestinians used to the idea. But when Arafat rejected the deal, which was 96% of the West Bank and all of East Jerusalem. Now, I say that lightly, but the details, have a lot of devil in it. And I can't back up that statement, but this was part of the transcript from Fareed Zakaria's interview. He walked away from that. And in retrospect, things would have been so much better if he hadn't. But he probably was afraid for his life, that if he accepted it, that Hamas would take him out. So unfortunately, the terrorists control the agenda. And then who replaces Netanyahu? He's been weakened, but Likud puts up Ariel Sharon, another general, and he leads the right wing. He is not religious. He thinks he's got to prove his piety by visiting Temple Mount. And perhaps endorsing laying the keystone for the third temple. And no Israeli minister had ever done that, walked up on Temple Mount and near the mosque of Al-Aqsa. And that provoked the second intifada, extreme violence for 3 years. So this then back and forth pushes Israelis even further to the right with their new immigrants from the Soviet Union. And so we get to Donald Trump, and I'll just say something about the Abraham Accords. The basic formula for that is not peace for land. It is economic incentives, investment incentives. Land is not going to change hands. And the statement that was made towards the end of the Zakaria's program, look, there are about 7.2 million Arabs and 7.2 million Jews between the Jordan River and the Mediterranean, and they're not going anywhere. And you've got to divide the land. We've got the legal framework under the Geneva Conventions of 1949 and international law. If you look at what percent of all of Israel, which most of it is desert, the Palestinians really are only getting 22% of agricultural land. I can't vouch for that statistic, but if that's true, that gives you a pause. But anyway, what we've learned with the terrible events of October is you just can't shunt the Palestinians aside. And that's what Biden and the Saudis were about ready to do with the Abraham Accords. And it was rumored that Saudi Arabia was going to recognize Israel and join the 4 other Arab countries that have under the Abraham Accords. Abraham meaning both the Israelis and the Arabs are cousins, they're Semites, and you just can't ignore the Palestinians, and that's the thing. Was the conclusion the final person to be interviewed by Fareed is this guy, a former U.S. ambassador. And he says, listen, there's a body of negotiations that can be built on. And that's the only hope. All right. So optimism, pessimism, I'll stop there. Fareed does go ahead and talk about some optimistic things, but I'll save that for next week. So comments? All right.
Well, it was interesting, John, that you commented on or started this program in 1967, and that was the year that I made that road trip across through Central Asia, and we basically the 6-Day War. I think that was where you started up. Your talk today was probably after the 6-Day War, if I'm not mistaken.
Yes, exactly.
And so, as I recall, we ended up having all of our passports. We couldn't get into Iraq, Jordan, or Israel. And at that point in time, you could get into Israel, but you couldn't go then back out to any of the other Middle Eastern countries. So we had to go from Israel down out to the Mediterranean somewhere, Turkey or some other place. But yeah, in Nepal, it happened to be the king's birthday, and so we went into Nepal and the start of the 6-Day War. And when we got back out of Nepal, the war was over. So it was very interesting to, and it got no new news because it was the king's birthday.
All right. Yeah. What's going on?
Hey, John.
David.
Yeah, a couple thoughts. Thanks, presentation.
Yeah.
Oh, thanks, Heiko. The 2 things I found interesting is, one, there was a huge immigration of Jews between 48 and 56, 800,000, and they all came from the Arab countries. Because as soon as Israel was formed, all the Arab countries declared war and basically kicked out all the Jews from all their countries. So I think it's estimated that the largest population of Jews in Israel right now came from Arab countries, which people don't always realize. But the mixing of the, who's from where and who belongs to what is pretty intense. And then the other is that, everybody talks about the million Palestinians who've been displaced, but there's almost 250,000 Jewish people who were displaced by the October 7th, invasion into southwestern Israel. But just, there's 2 sides to all these things, and they're just so intertwined. And I think you did a really good job of portraying that. Thank you.
Yeah, thank you, David. You have a unique perspective, and I've been kind of putting off this update that is bound to touch on the horrible things that happened, and the events that I talk about are in no way meant to detract from the horrible recent events. It's just a part of history. And I thought that Zakaria laid it out fairly even-handedly with two people that were there, and at least got the refreshed our memory as to the sequence of events, which are obviously very important. Yeah, Bob.
Oh, I just want to commend you on what I thought was a pretty objective view, sticking to chronology, and it's not easy to touch what in politics is often called the third rail. And I will watch the Zakaria interviews, which I haven't done yet. It's a problem fraught with a situation which populations all over the world have had to deal with for thousands of years, which is the movement of populations, the exchange of land for population. It's not, I mean, we've had it so recently, just after the Second World War, between Ukrainians and Poles, between Russians and Germans. It's not a new subject. It's just that this one seems to be a very intractable version of it. That's all I'll say.
Yeah, yeah. And we're certainly seeing it in Ukraine now. Yeah. All right. Well, thank you, David and Bob. I know you guys have had skin in the game, obviously, and I wanted to. I'm glad you were here to correct anything I might have misspoke.
Well, one thing that comes up that my son had a girlfriend, and her family her mother was from Palestine, and the father ended up, I think, to avoid the draft, ended up down in South America, and then ultimately teaching English in Palestine. And what's just really tragic over the years and watching that is that essentially the Palestinians have just been prisoners in their own land. And it's just so crazy. It's the fact that you've come up here with they can't go out of Palestine. They can't get a visa to go anywhere. There really is, they're kind of, the young people have really nothing to do but to fight, I guess, is just crazy.
Yeah, pretty intractable when you got young men with nothing to do.
I used to think of the PLO and Hamas as allies, sort of devoted to the same cause. But there's one thing that's happened recently is a split between them that was exploited by Netanyahu consciously. And I wonder how that's, just as Israel's kind of caught between its liberal wing, the Labor Party, and its right-wing extremists, will the Palestinians be caught between two groups claiming to represent them, the PLO and Hamas? I know one's more in Gaza and one's more in the West Bank, but it seems like they're speaking with two quite different voices now.
Yeah, and there wasn't an election right after the White House Oslo signings. Hamas was active by then. I can't tell you exactly when the election was, but Arafat won solidly. But the first election where they really went head to head was in Gaza. The Israelis left around 2005 unilaterally. They just decided we're out of here. I think it was Sharon. David can correct me. And the first election that was held just in Gaza, the PLO was ascendant, but Hamas challenged them, and in 2006, Hamas won. Just because of all the stuff that had been going up, and it just continued to go on after Sharon walked on Temple Mount. The Intifada went on for another 3 years, and I think it was in the context of the second Intifada that Israel just decided, it's untenable for us to try to control Gaza. Let's just turn it over to the PLO. Well, the only problem was they had the election and Hamas won. And there hasn't been an election since. They won the first and final election. Yeah. Okay, folks. All right. Next week we'll get back to Junipero and see him move up Baja, which is in itself is kind of an interesting journey. So stay tuned.
Thank you, John.
Thank you, John.
Thanks, John.
All right, my pleasure.
Thanks, John.
Bye-bye.